We get going? All right, we're going to get started and understand there might be some late arrivers sneaking in. So I'm Deb Mathias, the director of the QRIS National Learning Network with the BUILD initiative.
And I'm Rebecca Berlin, the interim CEO at Teachstone and your hostess for this lovely conference.
So we were trying to think about how is class fitting into state system building. So we thought we'd throw up a few slides and have a discussion with you folks about what you're seeing and what you're thinking and learning, and we'll keep going. Okay, this part we didn't practice. All right, it worked. Introductions, good. Okay, so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the basic framework of the QRIS, a quality rating improvement system strategy states are using to build out a framework and infrastructure for early childhood system and alignment. Okay, and we're going to talk about theory of change, a little bit about accountability, continuous quality improvement, cross-sector use of observation tools, and at the end of the PowerPoint, I put some samples of what different states were doing last year in terms of how they were putting together cut scores and scores between class and ERS and different observation tools. I just wanted to point out that that'll be on the website and available to you to have a look at when we have a little more time. We're going to talk a little bit about the impact of all of this on professional development, technical assistance, and have time for a discussion. So, okay, roll it. So we're going to try to move through some of this first part very quickly so that we have more time to engage around some of the topics that you want to talk about with us. Here's a map. It's on the website of the QRIS National Learning Network, the NLN, QRISnetwork.org, showing the development of states in terms of planning, pilot, implementation of QRIS across the country. Everybody always says, what's going on in Missouri? They need legislative action in order to get going on something that would be called a QRIS. So they're kind of in a hold pattern, but I have to hand it to them. They're doing a lot of great building out in terms of professional development systems and accountability systems. So they're working around the edges and still, creating some infrastructure pieces.
Deb, one of the things I was just going to say about this, I was thinking about the comment Arizona made during their presentation was, while all QRIS systems have similar pillars, similar foundations, we have 50 states, and then when you take into account the Floridas and the Californias and the Minnesota, which one? This is a new one for me.
Is it Kansas?
The Kansas that have localities can make some changes. So we have almost 100, well, actually more than that, QRS type systems in this going on. And so really thinking about how people are leveraging them a little bit differently is very interesting. And then on the research side, it's hard to get our handle around, okay, what is working and what not, because there are so many factors going into this.
Right, and not only that, they're built on different foundations of licensing, which vary state by state. And then you have different standards within the QRIS that vary state by state. So really comparing across the states or across the country, but there are some things we're learning. QRIS began as a strategy in the late 1990s to really improve the quality of child care. It was a system that began to up the ante over licensing because we were concerned and seeing detrimental effects for children in school that were in very poor quality child care. And these were often our most at-risk and high-need children. So you saw states begin to implement this as a strategy to offset that. Really, race to the top consolidated QRIS as a strategy for alignment cross-sector and for bringing this whole idea into a more common conversation, and led to this. Okay? Principal elements of quality. There's not going to be any surprise for this group of people here, and you can see highly skilled providers, language-rich environment, warm, responsive teacher-child interactions. The goal of the QRIS in this context, understanding the principal elements of quality, is to help programs engage in continuous quality improvement to get better at the services. We know quality matters. Many programs want and need to get better, and QRIS gives a pathway. How would you get better, and supports to how would you get better, right? So that combination of supports. And this is focused in this slide where you look at the basic components of a QRIS are around standards for programs and practitioners. So what are the standards? What do teachers need to know and be able to do? What are the standards for programs? Licensing, Head Start, pre-K within the QRIS, and it's an alignment of those standards. What are the supports? What are the accountability and planning structures? What are the financing supports for infrastructure as well as programs? And what are the engagement and outreach strategies for families, for providers, for stakeholders within the community? And this is on the slides. We've put this up already. Is there anything you want to add here?
I was going to say, you commented on the infrastructure, right? And I think there's two infrastructures, right? There's the infrastructure that's being built out at the state level or the county coalition level, and then the infrastructure for programs. And those are two very important things. And
Yes.
one of the things that I feel like states have struggled with is, and Sarah and I were talking about this earlier, like it's that infrastructure build out at the state level, and having enough resources in place to manage this system that includes assessment, professional development, feedback. And so how do you get those resources into a state system?
And for me, having been a state administrator in Pennsylvania for a number of years, you know, you look at the pie of what you have available for funding, and as you expand one pie for accountability, you have to take that funding away from somewhere else, maybe supports or infrastructure or professional development. So how do you divide the pie of the money up to get the best result for the programs and children within your state or territory? All right. So I just wanted to spend one moment talking about theory of change, because each state brings to the table a different thought about what are they trying to accomplish. Are they building the floor of quality up over baseline licensing? Or do they aspire to improve child outcomes and school readiness? Do they aspire to do other things? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But states are more and more going to the use of logic models to think that through. What are the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes? How is implementation science being used to provide a conceptual framework? For example, a number of the validation studies were done within states during an early implementation phase. And so what does that mean in terms of the results that they'll get and the view or the picture that will show about the effort versus a later implementation phase? And so there's a lot of thinking about where are you in implementation, how is that relating to your results, you know, how long has a star 4 been a star 4 or a high quality program, how long has a child been in that program, what's the dosage that they've received, you know, vis-a-vis absenteeism or, you know, the amount of time with that best practice teacher. These are all things that confound the research, and especially you add to that conglomeration across different licensing systems, across different QRISs, and it becomes a muddy picture to compare. So what does the end look like? What do we want in the end, and what do we aspire to? Is it all star 4s? Is it, you know, a bell curve? Is it a rocket to perfection? You know, like what is the end game? And that seems like an easy question to answer, but it's not as easy when you really get it to practicality. Yeah. Like what's the end of the class? Everybody has 777, you know?
No. I mean, I keyed out on this, like what does the end look like? And as I go across the country and talk to states, there are not a lot of states who have thought through this, right? And sometimes it's hard, right? Because you're like, I don't know what my funding will look like in 2 years. I don't know what will happen with the next governor change. But the more to Arizona, you have done a good job saying we're going to do pre-K, and then we're going to do toddler, and then we're going to do infant. The other question, is are people going to start doing aftercare? It's funny, I heard that question 4 years ago, and I haven't heard it a lot again recently. But the more you can both define this, and then the more you can, we were talking about this earlier, and I've talked with a number of people this week about it, is how are you communicating that logic model? How are you communicating that end? And when you think about all the layers, right, in a state system, that you have, that communication has to go through, state level, then your deputies, then regionals, then localities, then programs, then teachers. I mean, there are many stair steps in that, and we all get information in many different ways. And every state I talk to says, oh no, we've been communicating this. And the one thing I continue to say is, you cannot over-communicate this stuff. And the more people understand the why, remember I started off talking, I'm a big context person, why, the more you can help people understand the why of this, the more you will get buy-in. And sometimes that why gets lost in that messaging. So really spend time, it's important to really spend time on that piece of it.
So this question about, is the only outcome of this systems building child outcomes and school readiness, or have you articulated other outcomes? Catherine Tout and Marty Zaslow brought this conversation forward about 2 years ago in terms of thinking through, do we have professionalization of the workforce goals? Do we have aspirations around family engagement, improving early childhood as a system? And and family outcomes, are those family outcomes associated only with better outcomes for children, or other types of family outcomes? These are questions that people within the states are thinking about. All right, so accountability. Accountability, probably in the mid-2000s, everybody knows about the thinking about, are we getting what we pay for? Are we getting a good result? In one of the sessions we heard Yvette talking about the outcomes, the Head Start outcome data and project, and what that did to the field and how it caused everybody big pause. But the accountability part of the QRIS, quality rating improvement system. So the rating part, I think states often focused on first. How are we going to rate the quality of programs so that we can communicate with families and parents and understand the setting and the quality of the setting where we're placing our most at-risk children, right? And people were saying, if we're spending subsidized childcare money or pre-K money, we want to be in good environments with the children. So observational tools have become a big part of this accountability structure. I don't think that if you ask the authors of the tools, they at the beginning loved that part of it, or understood that that would happen with the tools, but it certainly has. And let me give a break here for you to chime in with.
I was going to actually comment, one of the biggest questions I get is this question about cut scores and where do they come from and how do you do that? And, there is no science to it, right? And what I say is every state is different and every county is different. And so people often ask me like, oh, can you give me California's cut scores, or can you give me New Mexico's, or can you give me Arizona's? Because I like that system and I want to model my program after that. Well, if you're using cut scores, they're based on your goals, right? And so those have to be met. And they're also based on where you started. So the thing that I really believe strongly, again, I keep commenting on Arizona, did a good job doing this, is taking that time. It's hard, right? The legislature or the programs want you to give numbers immediately, but the more you can say, I'm going to gather a year of pilot data, and I'm going to see where we are. Like, in some cases you have a little bit of idea, but in some cases you have no idea. And so it's important to match that. You know, what we know, we have some numbers from Educare systems, and we have some from Head Start, and we have, you know, from research, but every community is different, and particularly the funding you're putting behind your system is different. So really matching those scores as well as your goals. You know, is your goal just to get people on some kind of system? Or are you like, is my Colorado Denver guy isn't here, where they were already had people at 4s and 5s, and they just needed to have them have another step up. And so really thinking about that as you're thinking about where you're going to kind of put
yeah,
the scores.
and even have you had a lot of time to do a lot of professional development around the tool that you'll be using? Do you have a highly qualified workforce? Like, have you been implementing a Teach scholarship for years, or vouchers? Or do you have a lot of CDA certified staff or associate degreed? So it's the context that you're working and helps you understand. There are a lot of ways, just as a sidebar here, to deal with cut scores in terms of phasing in implementation, whether it's on all the scores, for example, with the class or not. So you might say in 2 sections, we're going to go with this cut score, and on instructional practice, you know, we're going to just get a score, and it's part of your CQI plan. But there's not a cut score until we have an opportunity to do more training and to develop, you know, our baseline for that. So states handle this in a variety of ways, and there are a lot of ways, even in implementation, that states are dealing with cut scores. So also, you know, thinking about applicability of the tools, whether they're program assessment, child assessment tools to the DLL population and the culture of the children and families that you're serving has to be a very high consideration. And there were sessions on this right before ours, so I'm sure many of you engaged more deeply in those topics. And what is the reliability and research about the assessment tool and the implementation of the assessment tool? So these are some of the things that we're thinking about with the accountability specifically in this range about the tools. So what are we seeing in terms of standards? Often states will use a tool to encapsulate a number of standards, right? So for example, some states use the environment rating scale, and then they didn't have to comment on, do you have a daily schedule or this or that, because they were included in the tool. Program administration scale, same thing. If you use that tool, you can do lighter touch on what are the program administrative standards, right? And with the class, you know, there are a lot of things that you don't have to go into because the class tool gives you that information, okay? So we're seeing states figure out, based on our theory of change a few slides ago, what can we eliminate in the standards, right, that is already covered in one of the tools we're using, or doesn't get us to what our goal of our system is. So if you don't have a goal around family engagement, or you don't want to enhance that, do you need family engagement in your scale and the monitoring and accountability section of the work around that outcome? See, this is where your theory of change and your theory comes to bear and what you put in your standards. The states are collapsing standards where documentation was the same. They're eliminating standards that didn't have a strong research base, that weren't connected to child outcomes and school readiness, that weren't aligned with research-based observational measures, that didn't have an objective basis for document. So if it was a parent report or a staff report, you know, is that something that you need to monitor and measure? We're going to get more into it later, but the way states are dealing with some of the softer side of the work that doesn't have the strong research base is by putting it into a quality improvement standard or a QRIS standard. So we may believe in the state that family engagement is an important component of school readiness, which is our goal, right? But instead of monitoring and measuring and giving the rating about the family engagement of the program, we're going to ask them to do a self-assessment around family engagement and put it into the CQI plan. See? So it's a way of taking down the number of standards we're monitoring and measuring, but still acknowledging them as important features to the work we're doing or the vision that we have for the system. Rebecca?
I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is I was surprised. Is anyone from Colorado here? Is when they just released, everyone seems to be following this, and when Colorado just released, I was actually talking to someone from Denver, when they finally released their QRIS revision, they actually went the opposite way and expanded it, right? And what's happening in the field in Colorado is that it's confusing, right? They're collecting a lot of information that may or may not, matter, or may not have a strong research base. And so if we want to take these programs to scale, while, it's hard because we have lots of different people who have opinions, and everything is important, right? I get it. But if you want to take them to scale and really be able to reach as many programs as possible, we need to really narrow these down to the ones that really have a research base and are driven to the child outcomes or the other outcomes that are honor based. And while the other ones are important, we need to start pulling them off and include them in some other way.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that point that Bob made this morning about focus. Where are you focusing your efforts? What is the payoff thing for your state and your group and your thinking? And you have to be able to shed some of that. Some of them were early proxies for performance, right? Like I remember a number of states, including our own, Pennsylvania, do you have a parent handbook and bulletin board? Do you have, like proxies for parent engagement, Now we're seeing people with way more sophistication, and as they reinvent their standards, coming at it from using a tool, Strengthening Families, or the federal tool, or other tools, using that data to inform your quality improvement program and make progress in that area. So oops, I don't know what I just did. Okay, it didn't turn off or anything. So people are looking at data, evaluation, and research more carefully. We're using integrated data systems and research as accountability tools. We're studying the use and appropriateness of the tools and the impact on children's school readiness. We're seeing states have young children given a student ID number at birth or when they enter a state-funded program that follows them through their educational system through college, so that we can better understand how the systems are working.
So remember I said the first most common question I get is about cut scores. I would say the second most common question I get is, what are the national class scores, right? People want to know how to compare themselves. And that, at this point, because of the way our data systems have been built at a state and a local level, that information doesn't exist. And it's hard, right? So it's hard to see the state of where we are as a country. Build is starting to pull some of that, but the more we can begin to start painting this picture, the more we can see what quality looks like across the country. And then the other piece on the data systems is, I think this is one of the biggest struggles. We were just talking with some people in New York City, right? And there's data, and then there's how do you access it, and then there's do the people understand it and know how to action about it. And I think we've come a long way, right? We've moved, although in state of class, I think it was, now this is more localities than states, but 50% of people are still putting class information on paper or Excel sheets, right? That's not accessible for up-to-the-minute information. So how do we continue to move into these systems that are robust enough so that administrators can pull information, coaches can pull information, and we can really, we're doing a good job collecting the data, but we're still struggling accessing that and really using it for improvement.
All right, the most common observation tools used across the country in the QRISs. You can see shifting and changing, and we'll talk about some of that in just a moment. You can see conglomerations of tools, ERS in another, ERS class in another, so people are really becoming more, I think, sophisticated in their use of the tools and how they're combining the use of the tools and how they're thinking about this. And I just think it's pretty interesting to see that. I have another one. Now, this is current as of last fall. The most common observation tools used in QRISs for family, home-based settings, and for center-based settings.
So I think is green is brown.
Yes,
Yep.
green is brown.
It took me, I was on the plane and I was like, I was really tired and I was like, I think I get it. And I was like, okay.
Thank you. That's funny.
But,
okay.
But what we see in most of the state QRIS systems that are using class is this idea where that Eckers is used maybe at the 1, 2, 3-star level. They get to a certain point, and then they add class, either at the 4 or 5 or the 3, 4 or 5. And that seems to be pretty common across the country. There's a few states that are using just class. Or just Eckers now, but most are using things in combination.
Yeah, and I think it's that movement. If you think about the history of QRIS beginning to remediate very poor quality childcare, bring it up over licensing, the use of the ERS is almost an instructional tool to stabilize global quality. And as the systems and the work is getting more sophisticated, people are moving beyond that. What's the next step? We have to get into the interactions in the classrooms between the teachers and the children, because that's where it's really going to happen, where it really does happen, and where we need to make improvements in order to get better outcomes, improved outcomes for the children. So, you know, this whole thing, is it part of the maturing of a system, a maturing of what we know and are learning? Yeah, do you have a question,
I'm just
please?
wondering if there's been any sliding back on the class as race to the top dollars disappear and people try to sustain the observation costs of using class in QRIS.
We haven't seen any change. We've more seen continuous movement to class.
That's been a discussion in my state.
Yeah.
So I just wondered.
And that's where that scaling up and becoming creative about the implementation strategies around a full-scale statewide implementation. This is where you saw states do things like the rating changes from every year to every 3 years. Or you're going to see states look at things like, if that center gets the cut score twice in a row, we're going to go 1 more year out. Or we're going to, you know, strategies like this to try to strengthen. And then they're thinking about, how do we use and economize the best on the TA, technical assistance, and professional developments. Like, what are we learning and what can we do better? And there's a lot coming out about that, and it's one of my favorite topics, so don't get me started, no. But it's like, you know, communities of practice. Someone brought this up in a workshop earlier yesterday, you know, talking about how they're working with 10 directors supporting teachers using the class. How do we create instructional leaders? How do we, you know, support the use of the tools in different ways? How do we, you know, have mentor teachers supporting new teachers in the use of the tool? Like, so is TA in essence also transforming in the face of this cost thing? Can we afford a TA person and a coach in every program? And then if not, what programs? What programs for what children? So these are going to become very deep questions. And, you know, do you hold some, you know, TA for the most at risk and high need communities? You know, how you triage it and think about it. Yeah. Did we have another? Okay. Okay, so now the I part, right? You were a perfect segue into the I part, the improvement part. States focusing more and more on the I of QRIS. It began with, we have all of the programs in and participating, and they're all 1s and 2s, right? So now, what's our next move, right? We've got to get better now. And so states really wrestling with, and people nationally across the country thinking about, how do we help programs make improvements and get better? What are the strategies? What are we learning about how to help teachers focus in on what's important? What's that sweet spot combination of curriculum, assessment, teacher interactions that gets us great classrooms and good places for kids to be. This is one of my favorite slides. And so it's good processes bring good results. Go see for, this is the Kazan part, right? Good processes bring good results. Go see for yourself to grasp the current situation, right? Speak with data, manage with facts, take action to contain and correct root causes of problems, work as a team. It's everybody's business, right? So that embodies a lot of what we're believing and creating that culture of improvement. If you come into a center and it's understood, I'm going to get a class score and I'm going to see that data and use that data, and part of my job is to think about how to get better and better at what I'm doing. It becomes a culture of improvement within the program. And I would say, you know, for me, the culture of improvement begins with the individual's own professional learning plan, whoever you are, wherever you sit, as the director, as the state leader, and then it works from there to the classroom, to the program, to the region, to the state level. At all those levels, what's the CQI plan and the data that feeds into helping you figure out how to improve your service? Whether you're a TA provider, a state level person, right? And certainly the class embodies this. So states are thinking about a lot of tools. Another trend we're seeing at the higher levels is that the program might get a little more autonomy about picking what tool they use for improvement, you know? So there's a lockstep part at the lower levels, building to quality. It's almost like, you know, till third grade you're learning to read and then reading to learn, right? So in the beginning you're kind of feeding the direction, and then you're giving the program the tools to do the CQI, looking at all their sources of evidence, compiling the data, and figuring out where are they going and which tools get them to the next level, right? We're seeing like eco tools, right? Some states really picking up on that, or programs really picking up on. We want to be thinking about, is the environment good and healthy for children? Are we having the farm to school project? Are we, you know, so it's interesting. It's not a simple thing. But I think you have to worry in that about losing focus on the important part. So I'm just saying that as a sideline, but I think a downside of that is losing the focus. So what we found in the long run, that states are really moving to this teaching and learning question. How do we improve teaching and learning in the state? How do we measure it better? How do we help it get better, right? My friends at CELO and I have been doing a couple of learning tables around teaching and learning and what are the payoff things and the feedback loops, of course, that the class and the focus on interactions along with implementation of a curriculum. And New Mexico has a great strategy about looking at curriculum implementation using really any kind of a curriculum, but how would you evaluate if it was being implemented? You guys have done a lot of thinking about that as well in South Carolina. And what are the assessment tools and how are they informing instruction? So this is, of course, a big one for the class work and the use of class as a tool to strengthen this teaching and learning part, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean this curriculum, right? Because I always say it's not just class by itself; it's class and. And one of the big ands is evidence-based curriculum. But that has always been the question, right? From 5 years ago when I started doing this state work, people would always ask that question, like, we want to include curriculum. Louisiana was asking this, but how do you assess the use? Like most places just say, yes, they have it. I saw it. It's included.
Over there.
It's right. It's over there on the shelf, right? It's included in the lesson plans, but they're, you know, doing fidelity on the use of the curriculum is a hard thing. And I think that's one of these next steps that we're going to see around
and
QRIS.
Sarah Daly from Child Trends and New Mexico are making some headway in thinking about this curriculum implementation. And if you want to talk more about that, we certainly can. So as states are promoting school readiness, they're thinking about the teaching context. So adding standards for planning time, right? and preparation. What is staff evaluation in states looking like, especially in the face of the K-12 staff evaluation picture, and where are we going to go with that in early childhood, and do we align, do we teach them, how is it going to happen? Improving staff benefits, financing for credentials and degrees, a lot of questions, creating that profession, a huge topic now that NAYC is leading, thinking about for us, which we really appreciate. So it's not just what are the teaching and learning standards and constraints, but what is the context for teaching, for teachers, right? And for me, the supporting program leaders, important component. How are we helping leaders? I loved what Bob said this morning about the leader of the program kind of keeping the clutter away from the teacher so they can focus on the teaching and learning in the room. And that is the job of the administrator. I thought that was really a great. But we don't often haven't talked with child care directors in particular about being the instructional leader of the program, and seeing themselves in that way, or having somebody see themselves that way within a program, right? So one interesting thought about the use of the tools when you're at the state level, thinking about implementing this within a big framework like a QRIS is, can it go across the sectors? Pre-K, Head Start, childcare, across the settings, and across the age groups, right? So I think that was another reason that we had early visibility with the ERS and a lot of the systems that began in the mid-2000s, right? And as you know, classes moving forward and the other age groups and of course the settings. If you want alignment in the QRIS between the standards and different, programs like Head Start using class, like even if states are using ERS, they often acknowledge the class score or have a streamlined participation for programs using that.
Interestingly, on Thursday, I just looked at my calendar and I have a call. ACF is doing a listening call on the idea of consolidation of monitoring. And so is there, this people have been talking about this for years.
Yes.
This was a big thing for Linda Smith when she took over the office. But you were starting to have these conversations is there a way, that you can begin to combine some of the monitoring that's happening for licensing and childcare and Head Start and pre-K? Because, there are programs who tell these stories. I've heard stories in New York where they say, I have X number of observations done because of these different things that we're involved in.
Yeah,
so
we have to look at that for economies, right? How can we leverage this and save money and hassle for everybody involved? So yeah, and Ohio's begun that already, the work of cross-sector monitoring. So we're really seeing some trendsetters there. All right. So on the professional development side, how the tools work, why the tool is important, what is it showing, what can you learn, how to use the data. You guys have talked a lot about that in ongoing improvement. I think we had a great question earlier today about higher ed, right? How are we bringing higher ed within our states to the table? What are you guys seeing about professional development? The My Teaching Partner, of course, is a great resource.
I have one small. We, as an organization, have invited ourselves to local universities around. What?
Speak up, that's it.
Universities around, just to kind of. Hey, we're out here, use our information and knowledge.
Yeah, it's important. As you said, they've been, I say that on both sides, universities, invite yourself to the state table. Don't tell me you're not being invited. Just invite yourself, figure out a way you get there. Or if you're a locality and there's conversation, invite yourself to that table. It's important. Like, we have to tie these systems together, because I say this all the times to deans of education schools. So what's happening, I just want to let you know that what's happening at the state level is that your graduates, I use these words, right, are having to be remediated, and when you say that word, they flip out. They are being remediated by our local systems. The money we are investing in professional development for people who just graduated from state-funded or privately funded programs, that's embarrassing, right? So how can you begin to use the 21st century QRIS information within your programs? It's a fight we've been trying to do for a number of years, and it's very slow in coming. And so I think it's about, in states and communities, just inviting yourselves to each other's table, because that's the only way to move it forward.
And looking inside professional development and technical assistance, we're thinking about how are we supporting the technical assistance and professional development instructors. So do they have opportunities for their own community of practice? I had this question earlier when we were talking. What is the metric you're using to evaluate the technical assistance? What's the data source for the technical assistance provider to be looking at and using in their improvement plan, right? Or your assessors, what's their data source? How are they improving their work, right? So thinking about this quality improvement at every level. It's not just the program, it's the implementing partners, it's the state, the university, everybody in it together. So what's working? We've kind of gone on through some of these, but benchmarking and sharing success, certainly at this conference, we've heard a lot of great information about success stories. You've been meeting at lunch, talking with others, asking each other probably this question, what's working, What are you guys figuring out or learning? We're revising metrics, supporting teachers and programs to use their data. We were talking after an initial presentation yesterday about, do you have a form that says how we're going to use data so that people understand that's just part of what's going to happen here? How do you create a culture? Becomes a question. How do you create a culture of improvement from whatever chair you're sitting in and help that creation of a culture within a state? We're talking about leadership and developing internal program capacity. So does someone have a question or something they want to add in or that resonates in what we've been saying? Yeah.
I'm curious, I'm lucky to work in a context now where we have a publicly funded full day seat in pre-K for any 4-year-old that wants it. And so now that we've reached this place in my city, I think we increasingly feel a mandate and responsibility to make information available to families who, for their given neighborhood, in one single application, list up to 12 programs that, in order of choice, that they want to send their child to for pre-K. And right now they don't have any information to do that, but we have a lot of data. And so I'm wondering if there's any data on how parents and families are using the STAR rating, the publicly available ratings for programs, to make decisions for their children. Is there anything available or any feedback from the field on how it's being used?
It's being used differently in different states and contexts depending on how many rated programs are available. For one thing, states aren't going out with a big ad campaign if there aren't a wide variety of all levels of program, because it's frustrating, Go to our STAR 1 through 5, there's no 4s and 5s, So it depends on the phase of implementation, and then you think about other states are doing things like report cards or information sharing or posting about citations, STAR level. I don't know if any post class scores or.
Well, no, some
aggregate.
It's inferred as part
in
of the
a
rating, right? You can get to it if you're a smart parent based on.
But a lot of states are referring parents in subsidy when they pull the list, prioritizing the higher level programs for referral.
So
Do-
CCR and ours are the ones that are
Exactly.
telling parents,
Yeah.
using the stars, but not the actual class or ERS.
Well,
scores.
like she said, the star like,
They might- they
is
won't have
inferred
that,
in
right.
the class score is inferred in the rating. So I think that, and we have some places where parents get a voucher to use in a higher quality program. Things like that are beginning to happen too. Yeah.
I'm with Maryland Excels, and I can show you on my phone, we have a mobile app that is to help the parents find a child-rated or a star-rated childcare program by zip code, by one of the 5 levels. We do have, now we have about 5,000 participating programs around the state, which is, I believe, about, it's over 50%, I think it's 75% of the licensed child care entities in the state are participating in Maryland Excels. And a bunch of that big jump in our enrollment was because it became mandatory if they accept subsidy vouchers.
Yeah.
So
The
we have
parents
a
use
mobile
it?
app for the parents. And again, that's through our partner at Johns Hopkins University. They're our technology partner. So they are tracking how many hits it gets and whatever. And they know that a large percentage of the downloads was from staffers.
Yeah,
So,
right, yeah.
But anyway, but that was part of the outreach to the parents is a little mobile app.
Oh, good. Well,
which I have on my phone.
that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that. So thank you for coming. I invite you to continue this conversation. So Deb and I and Sarah Neville Morgan and then Bentley Ponder and Padma Rajan are going to be leading the next session, which is a big group session in the main ballroom about what's next. So we're all going to just speak for a few minutes, kind of based on the conversations we've had here about what's coming next, what are we working on next, and then we're inviting the audience to participate in that as well. So please kind of follow us over to the ballroom.